Judge, Shifters Forever Worlds Book 24, by Thorne.
Prologue. Mac stirred. Something had awakened her. What was it? She heard the sound again. A phone vibrating. Lance's phone. He lunged for the nightstand. Sorry, I was hoping to keep from waking you. It's okay. His expression changed. She couldn't pin it. He swiped across the screen and put the phone to his ear. Judge? He paused, then, what the hell do you mean, AWOL? Judge. Judge. He glanced at the cell screen, then set the phone down. Connection lost. I should call Cruz.
Chapter 1. Alanna Myers, Lonnie to those who were close to her, willed the queasiness away. Will though she might, she had no luck. The persistent urge to upchuck the non-existent contents of her stomach didn't go away. Pregnancy. Not joyful. She cursed herself for her impulsive nature. I shouldn't be impulsive, should I? Did being an intuitive make her more prone to rash acts? Some poster child for her kind she was. 4 years ago, when she'd applied and made it to the Shifter Council Compliance Unit, she'd been hailed as a poster child for her type. Lonnie was an intuitive. Intuitives and shifters didn't work together. The relationships between the two paranormals had been strained for centuries. A treaty had put the bad blood aside, at least on the surface, and allowed for both the shifter community and the intuitive community to work together. One of the conditions the treaty declared was that intuitives could work within the Shifter Council's special operations units, including the compliance unit. Word had it, applications would be considered. Lonnie and her best friend, Pepper, applied for appointment. Only 2. Of the entire intuitive community, only 1 got in. Lonnie. Poster child for the intuitives. She'd made it in, passed the rigorous testing with flying colors. Her parents had been thrilled to no end. Lonnie, their middle child with no aspirations to speak of, no goals or dreams, had made it to the SCCU. No, she wasn't an enforcer, of course not. Only shifters could be enforcers. But she'd made it in, and they'd created a special position for her, compliance unit consultant. It had taken the intuitive community years to get to the point where shifters would accept their skill set as valuable, and now they had. And I've just fucked it all up completely by walking out. Could they consider her AWOL? She wasn't technically a shifter. She wasn't an enforcer. Yeah, but I did sign that damn contract. Yes, she had signed it. She'd signed on for a 4-year term, just like the shifters did. And I had a month to go. She'd sent her life up in flames with one sudden, life-altering decision. But I had to go. I had to leave. And nothing could convince her she'd been mistaken for leaving. Even if she was wrong for doing it.
Chapter 2. Fucking cell phones. You'd think we'd become advanced enough to not lose signal when we hit valleys. Judge Cruz slapped the phone down on the seat of his new pickup truck. He bought the truck after he'd landed at the airport a couple hours ago. He had the dealer meet him at baggage claim and give him a ride to the dealership. There, Judge paid cash for a new pickup. It was new to him, though not exactly brand new. Now he was on his way home. Home. His cabin. He'd waited 4 years, patiently serving his time in the Shifter Council Compliance Unit. That time was done. Judge had a whole year off. Time to decompress. A year to decide if he wanted to go back. Big decision. One he wasn't ready to deal with just yet. And luckily didn't have to. He surveyed the site before him. He was 2 valleys and 1 set of mountains away from Bear Canyon Valley and his own cabin on the mountain range. Bear Canyon Mountain Range. 3 mountains. 3 peaks. 3 brothers. 1 peak for each brother. Cross had Cragg's Peak. Lance had Devil's Horn. Judge had taken Dragon's Point. The name of the place had always called to him. Dragon's Point. He told the old shifter they called Grizz that he wanted to put a home at the top. You're a grizzly shifter, Grizz said and laughed. Do dragon shifters even exist? His younger self had asked Grizz. This brought another laugh. Dragons are in fairy tales. Everyone knows that. So are werewolves and other shifters, but we exist had been Judge's last thought on the matter. But old Grizz, or fate, had somehow made it so his brothers picked the other peaks. How it worked out so well, Judge never knew. By all rights, as the youngest, and as the last one to pick, he'd never expected to have Dragon's Point. And yet he did. He'd set up his cabin. He'd even put together Lance's cabin for him. The one he hadn't messed with was Cross's. Judge knew why. Oh yeah, he knew about Cross's communication room. Cross was a lot higher in the compliance unit hierarchy than he let on. But Cross was too tight-lipped to disclose. Probably why he rose so high in the ranks. Though Judge hadn't done too badly himself. As for their brother Lance, well, he was a different one altogether. He wasn't too interested in rising in the CU. Lance had gone, sure, but Judge had always wondered if he'd had an ulterior motive for joining. He sighed at the thought of his brothers. Would they have grown up differently if they'd had their parents? As though they were real grizzlies who needed their space, so did the Del Cruz brothers. I should have called Cross to begin with, not Lance. Cross, as eldest, and with that badass communication room, could have helped Judge figure out what the hell was going on. Might as well call him. Cross picked up on the first ring. In the background, Judge could hear Cross's mate, Ariadne's soft voice. Ariadne, the best thing that could have happened to Cross. She'd softened an edge his brother didn't like to show to anyone. Yeah, Judge knew all about Cross's softer side. He'd seen the stray animals he had helped when they were younger. But Cross never showed that human side of himself. He'd always had the gruff, rough exterior. But the moment Ariadne entered Cross's life, a little over a month ago, the difference in his brother's voice had been evident. The distinct sound of joy. Joy, something the Del Cruz brothers never had much of. Cross stepped right into a conversation with Judge, as if they'd been in the middle of a chit-chat. What's on your mind? Shouldn't you be pulling in any time soon? Looking for a dinner invite? There it was. That joy in Cross's voice. There was something else, too. If Judge hadn't talked to Lance 2 weeks ago, he'd have never known. Never known the old shifter he'd always known as Grizz was actually their uncle. Never known Judge and Lance's father had killed his half-brother, Cross's father. Then he had been killed in retribution, leaving the boys homeless and orphaned. All this time, Judge had thought he, Lance, and Cross had the same father. He'd have never known his, and Lance's father hadn't exactly been a great guy either. That the third brother, Grizz, was the best one of the bunch. And after the boys were left fatherless, Grizz, who'd been in the Shifter Council compliance unit, had learned his brother's children were in foster homes, shuffled from one to another, kept only a short time because of their tendencies to fight. Cross's bear wanted to kill Lance's bear. Cross's bear remembered the day his father had been killed. It wanted retribution from the time they were little, and had repeatedly tried to kill Lance. That got the three boys kicked out from home after home, until they finally ended up in May Forrester's care. Then Grizz had shown up one day. He'd asked them to keep his existence a secret, and since then, he'd been like a father figure to them, coming to each one during rough times. Judge. Cross's voice brought him back. I'm guessing you didn't call for an invite to dinner then. Judge cleared his throat. Not exactly. On the other end of the phone, Judge felt his brother's tension setting in. Cross had picked up on his tone. Remember Lonnie? Alanna Myers, that Lonnie. From the same CU squad. Judge took a deep breath. As far as descriptions went, that barely touched the tip of the iceberg when it came to Lonnie, at least when it came to Judge's feelings about her. Yeah. That Lonnie. Got a call from a guy in our squad. This was a stretch. Lonnie wasn't in Judge's squad anymore. She hadn't been since that morning. He said she'd gone AWOL. You're out though. Right. Technically, yes. Judge was out. He had done his 4 years, and was on his 1-year furlough. The 1 year where an enforcer of the compliance unit could decide if he wanted to go back or not. Judge already knew the answer to that. Yeah, I'm on my leave. So, why would you be called about her absence without leave? He let out a slow exhale, pulled the truck onto the side of the road, the tiny pebbles crunching beneath the truck's wheels. He slipped it into park and took his foot off the brake. Adjusting the angle of the phone against his face, he clenched the steering wheel in a white-knuckled grip. I just would. He didn't feel like getting into it. You just would? Just like that. An enforcer on furlough would be called because of another squad member's AWOL. Suspicion underscored Cross's tone. We were close. That was all. Judge was willing to give up on the matter. Close. Fraternizing close. The kind of close that gets you tossed out with a dishonorable mention on your record. I'm not with the CU anymore. You're still accountable for your behavior. The last thing Judge was in the mood for was a damned lecture on his behavior when he was in the unit. Come on, Cross. What the fuck? You know I don't break the rules. If one went to hell for lying, Judge knew he'd be headed straight there. No passing go, no collecting $200, no nothing. Just straight to jail with my ass. Especially since I'm guilty. As if he'd confessed to that. It was one night, for fuck's sake. One night. One mistake, if Lonnie had her say. One mistake that led her to dropping out of their squad and dropping out of sight. Permanently. You sure you don't break rules? More suspicion in Cross's tone. Fuck it, bro. Judge swiped to end the call with a quick jerk, tossed the damn phone onto the seat, shoved the truck into gear, and took off for his cabin.
Chapter 3. Judge was getting closer. Lonnie could feel it. Feel the way intuitives felt when they'd imprinted with someone. A low vibrating thrum, as though her body had a tuning fork, would signal with an inaudible drumming that pulsed deeply inside. The blessing and the curse of being an intuitive. She hated it sometimes. Maybe this was one of those times. Lonnie sucked air in, her lungs burning from the effort. Big deep breaths to help her push oxygen through her body. Big deep breaths to calm her nerves. Judge was coming. She'd see him soon. Very soon. The thrumming grew in its intensity. She held her hands out. Her fingers quivered. They hadn't spoken since that morning. The morning after. The morning after one incredible night that had been the culmination of more than 3 years working next to the only man she'd ever loved. The only one I'll ever love. She'd known better. She really had. Just because shifters let us in their midst doesn't mean they'd let us in their hearts. Sure, they'd let an intuitive into their compliance unit. Sure, they'd let one in their bed. It was for pleasure, not for mating, nor bonding. Oh yes, Lonnie knew all about the shifter couple bonding. How could any intuitive not? Intuitives read emotions. They translated auras, feelings, impressions. Intuitives had been used to solve crimes over the years. Not that there weren't charlatans and fakes, of course there had been. The intuitive community was on a mission to reveal those charlatans. And as such, Lonnie became the first intuitive. The next year, another intuitive followed in her steps, but Lonnie was always held as an example. Look where that's gotten me. On the run, in hiding, in need of help, and reaching out to the very same man she left in a lurch one Saturday morning with only one sentence. I can't do this. Those had been her last words. She'd scurried from his apartment, half her clothing on, the other half in a crumpled mess in her hands. Her skin had still been rosy from the sex they'd had all night. Her body smelled like the sex they'd had. Her pores, her breath, her sweat, everything exuded and reminded her of Judge Cruz. Judge. With his olive skin. With his darker-than-sin eyes. With his wide shoulders that could block a door. With his waist that tapered to a delicious V she'd licked and kissed that night. A heat crept to Lonnie's cheeks, hiding in his cabin up in the mountains, having memorized the things he'd shared with her over the years. "I'm such a stalker." No, she wasn't. They'd been the best of friends during the last 2 years in their squad. He'd shared everything about his life, his brothers, the mountains, and the valley he'd come to love. The foster homes he'd been shuffled in and out of. Sure, he'd shared a lot. That was what people did with intuitives, they shared. Clearly, it was what shifters did too. Which was why Lonnie was so good at her job. Which was also why she'd felt his confusion that morning. Had his big old grizzly bear ego found it too much to accept? Or had he been confused because they'd gone from a great friendship to a colossal mistake? What else could she call a one-night stand between the two of them but a colossal mistake? It wasn't that she wasn't in love with Judge. God. She was so in love with him, she couldn't shake the imprint of him from her soul. But she knew shifters. She'd heard them talking. And she'd heard her own people talking. Shifters didn't couple bond with intuitives. And no self-respecting intuitive would want to be mated to a brutish shifter who had no emotions and spent his time rutting and womanizing. Except that wasn't how shifters were. Her people had that so very wrong. Why would they perpetuate the myth? She'd once asked Pepper, her best friend, why she thought their own kind had that opinion of shifters. Because if we mated with shifters, our babies would be hybrids. Their intuitive qualities would be diluted with shifter genes. Silly, Pepper had answered quickly and with a laugh, as though it was a given. But they didn't know shifters the way she did, working in close proximity. They didn't know Judge Cruz. The first time she'd met him all those years ago. They'd been in New York, at the headquarters for the Shifter Council. An elder named Mikhail Romanoff had been in attendance for the swearing-in of new members of the compliance unit squads. There'd been 6 shifters of various types, bears, a lion, 2 tigers. And then there's me. Lonnie had been the only non-shifter, and she'd also been the only female. She noticed there seemed to be a shortage of females in the compliance units. It rankled her feminist side, but she kept her mouth shut, glad they'd let her join, even though it wasn't in the capacity of enforcer. As if I could be an enforcer. Enforcers were shifters. Enforcers killed. Enforcers captured. An intuitive had 0 innate desires to kill, and no training in killing or capturing. Mikhail Romanoff and his underling grabbed the papers they'd signed, all 6 of the shifters and Lonnie, then they left the room. She glanced at the other occupants, all shifters, all male. She swallowed hard, resisting the urge to clear her throat because the room was so quiet. She looked down at her hands. Why did I sign up for this again? Oh yeah, to get away from my nagging mother. And to make Dad proud. That too. One of the shifters stepped forward, a giant of a man with blonde hair and hard features. I'm James Dorsey. I'll be your Colorado commanding officer for those who don't know. Step forward and introduce yourselves, including your position. One stepped forward, a lithe man with a wolfish grin. Benedicio Tomez. You can call me Bull. Reconnaissance. Another stepped up, slightly larger. Carmichael Jones, the dark-skinned man stated. Enforcer. His chest swelled with pride. His smile was contagious. His aura gave away his pride. Lonnie glanced down to avoid smiling back. She wasn't sure about this group yet, and didn't want to give away any advantages being an intuitive would have. Judge Cruz. A deep voice rumbled through Lonnie, touching her senses, making her body tense with an unfamiliar impression, one she couldn't name. She looked up. A striking dark-haired man joined the first 2. His eyes narrowed. The man clearly meant business. Enforcer. Again, his voice traveled through her body as if it were a physical entity. With chiseled features and an intensely black gaze, the man locked eyes with Lonnie. She couldn't pull away. She couldn't save herself from the sensation of drowning in his aura. Deeper and deeper, he pulled her under into his being, into his essence. It wasn't until a 4th man stepped between them, breaking their stare, that she was able to look away. And that was the first experience Lonnie had with Judge, 4 years ago. She knew he was here. Not in the cabin, but outside. She heard a vehicle pull up. She didn't need supernatural shifter hearing to know one had. But she wouldn't have known who it was without her own intuitive skills. Her skills, her imprint, picked up on his essence, the thrumming so intense it made her want to shake like a leaf. No. This isn't normal. This isn't what imprinting does. This was what Judge did to her. Each and every damned time. Footsteps on the porch. A key in the lock. The dark cabin flooded with sunlight coming in from the front door. A silhouette stepped forward, blocking the sun. Judge. Keys dropped to the floor. It wasn't lost on Lonnie that she'd trespassed on his territory, broken into his cabin, and now sat here without a glimmer of guilt or fear. Of course, he'd never see or know the emotions swirling within her. What the hell are you doing here?
Chapter 4. Judge didn't know the car in the driveway in front of his cabin, but then again, it could be anyone. May or Mac or Ariadne, or one of his brothers, if they decided to buy a new car. Or it could even be Grizz. He tried to take in the scent but got nothing. Odd. Hunter's block was being used, clearly. But why? Why would one of his family or friends want to hide their presence? He opened the door, fear the last thing on his mind. He was a grizzly shifter, an enforcer. Why the hell should he be scared? He dropped his keys. Judge stared. That was all he could do. Lonnie was the last person he'd expected to see here. Really, she was the last person he'd expected to see, period. He'd be lying if he said that seeing her didn't affect him. He'd spent years getting to know her, working closely with her on cases. They'd saved each other's lives on more than one occasion, she with her intuitive skills, and he with the brute force innate to his grizzly shifter. He hadn't seen her since that one morning. The morning after the night they made what clearly she thought was the biggest mistake of her life. She had to have thought that, for why else would she have said what she did? Why else would she have requested a transfer to another unit, and left before Monday morning? The new unit had sent her deep undercover. Judge never saw her again. He'd left texts. He'd left messages. No response. And now she was here. He studied Lonnie, sitting at his table, her eyes ringed by hollow dark circles. Her curvy body was hidden from him by the table's wood surface. Her long dark hair was pulled back from her face, reminding him only too well of the times he'd held it back, fisting it in a ponytail while she leaned down and took him in her mouth. Damn her. Damn her to hell for leaving him in a lurch, with no explanation, no decisions to be made. In a short 24-hour period, they'd gone from team members and best friends to lovers, to nothing. Not even acquaintances. Her throat worked as if she were swallowing her words. Well? He crossed his arms across his chest. To what do I owe this pleasure? He fought to keep the sarcasm and hurt from his voice. He failed. He could see it in her face. How the fuck could she put on a hurt look when she'd walked out on their friendship and their... What the fuck would I even call it? It wasn't like it was a relationship. His bear bellowed in Judge's mind. To his bear, Lonnie was the one. The only one. And her disappearance put his bear into a tailspin. For more than a week his bear had refused to come out, refused to morph, refused to allow Judge to take his shifter form. Judge had a hell of a time explaining his poor performance away that week. Then he'd had a come-to-Jesus moment with his bear. He'd explained to him that if they were kicked out of the compliance unit, there'd be no chance of ever seeing Lonnie again, no chance of ever finding her. The bear relented, and Judge was able to return to a shadow of his former life. Gone were the after-hours breakfasts he'd enjoyed with Lonnie when they'd finished an assignment. Gone were the Friday and Saturday pizza and a movie nights. Gone were the late-night phone conversations when she was having a rough time with her intuitive mother. Poof. Vanished. And now she was here. And she's AWOL, his bear reminded him. As if he needed the bear to tell him this. Was that why she was here? Are you hoping I can help you with the AWOL thing? Her face blanched. How do you? Her gulp was loud to his super-sensitive shifter hearing. They called you. Looking for me. She glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone to come barreling through it. You're going to tell them, aren't you? Give me a reason not to. I. She moved as if to rise from the table, but held on to its edge, like she might have needed the support. Judge stepped forward. Why are you here? Why are you AWOL at all? You should be done. You should be on furlough. We signed the same day. I was extended because I took an extra month away. Bitterness curdled his stomach, a bitterness at the idea she had taken a month away for some reason, and they'd granted it, and he'd never known. So why'd you leave? Why didn't you stay for the last month? What's the damned hurry that's got you risking AWOL? He frowned. Your contract is binding. You know they can exact justice on you for this. I had to. Her voice was weak, her eyes filled with a sadness. Why, Lonnie? Why? A big swallow, then pepper. She's in trouble. I can feel it. Judge cocked his head. What do you feel exactly? No lie, he had no clue how this intuitive shit worked. No clue at all. He'd scoffed at it until he'd seen Lonnie in action during their first few missions. After that, he'd always wondered why his kind scoffed at the contributions her kind had to offer. She sent a signal. She needed help. Then she went silent. Silent. Like dead? That kind of silent. Lonnie shook her head. The kind of silence like she was unconscious, then conscious. Then out again. That's not natural. The pulsations she's sending are more like ones of someone in distress. Can you peg where she is? She glared at him. You know it's not like a GPS. There was the Lonnie he'd known, full of fire. Welcome back, a part of him wanted to say. The other part of him wanted to slam his fist into the wall. She had a lot of nerve showing up like this, expecting. What the hell does she expect? So why are you here then? Granted, he hadn't had to say it like that. He didn't have to let the vitriol of her betrayal show in his voice. Her jaw dropped, and an emotion he didn't want to give a name to flashed across her face. Her skin went from a tired pale white to an angry red flush quicker than he could have snapped his fingers. She pushed off the table, strode toward the door, bypassed him with a swift sidestep. Judge took a deep breath as she passed. She opened the door and closed it with a slam behind her. Judge let the scent of her sit on his senses. It wreaked havoc on his bear, who in turn roared in Judge's mind. As if Judge's own body didn't feel like he had white water rushing through his veins and nerves. As if he didn't feel like he had firecrackers popping in his nerve endings. Lonnie was his fated mate. He'd accepted and embraced that fact long before their one-night stand. A one-night stand he'd never intended to have as such. He'd thought it was the beginning of something. He'd never thought it was the end of everything. Chapter 5. God, Judge could not rid his memories of the scent of her, the sex of her, the everything of her from his mind. Their night together had imprinted itself on his soul, and left him unable to even glance at another woman. That night so long ago, and yet as if it were yesterday. They were at her place, eating pizza, watching a movie on a thick carpet next to the fire. This time the movie had been Lonnie's choice. Some chick flick. He couldn't even remember the title. At the end of it, he turned to tease her about how sappy it was, but there were tears winding their way down her cheeks. Her eyes glistened with more unshed tears. Damn, the word escaped him in a hiss. Judge wasn't so good with emotions. He had no clue what to say to her. Sorry. She gave him a half smile, her face still shiny from crying. The smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It's okay. He grabbed the first thing he could, a pizza napkin, and dabbed at her cheeks. He'd left pizza sauce where the tears had been. He burst into laughter. My turn to be sorry. Judge pressed the pad of his thumb over the sauce, ran it down, then showed it to her. Oh God. It looks like I'm crying blood. She seized a clean napkin and went to town wiping the streaks he'd left on her face. He took the napkin from her. Let me. It's the least I can do since I made the mess. The firelight flickered golden amber flames in her eyes, pulling him and his bear in, closer, closer, even closer. Lonnie's eyes remained open, drawing Judge and his bear. His lips hovered over hers, their warmth emanating, the energy between them palpable. I like being with you too much, she said. It was as if it was a confession she didn't want to admit. And it made alarms ring for him and his bear. Truth. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, her skin almost feverish. His hand completely covered hers. Always. Lonnie squirmed under Judge's dark gaze, especially with the way his bear's presence flared golden flames in the depths of his eyes. He took so long to answer that she finally looked up at him. I like it too much myself. He curled his fingers under and ran his thumb over the tender skin on her wrist. Could he feel her heart racing? She knew shifters had extrasensory types of perceptions. So did intuitives, but a different type. Her pulse matched the butterflies zigging and zagging in her stomach. God. I've never felt this way before. You're a shifter. Shit. I did not just blurt that out. Yes, she had. Judge frowned. And Judge drew in a deep breath. He and his bear savored her scent, stimulating warmth along with a hint of her longing as it filled his chest, driving his bear crazy with a need to push out of his skin and make this woman see they were meant for each other. Despite the compliance unit's regulations. Regardless of their careers. In the face of the old rules that intuitives had about shifters. Even though the old notions persevered that shifters didn't appreciate or think highly of the intuitive skills. Was she trying to tell him to stay away? It was way too late for that. There wasn't a snowball's chance in hell he could lose the feelings he had for this intuitive woman. His bear knew she was their mate. He knew it too. Her fingertip brushed his chin, her touch so feathery, he glanced down to be sure it wasn't his imagination. His bear grumbled at him to seduce her, to make her theirs. Judge tuned his bear out, one of the few times in his life he'd done that. He captured her hand in his and pressed her palm against his lips, fighting the urge to unleash his desire, to crush her to his chest and claim her mouth. To touch her lips with his. To run his hands over her curves, without the barrier of clothing. Her body, hips to hold on to, offset by a waist that was just the right amount of narrow. His dick twitched. Judge grunted to contain it and his bear, hoping she hadn't noticed his reaction. He studied the fire, to keep from thinking of driving deeply into her. He could scent her wetness, musky, sexual, female, all Lonnie. She swallowed, the sound loud, her pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to cover them, because hearing her reaction to him served as a fuel that heightened his desire. She swiped her tongue over her lower lip, nervously. That did it. There's just so much a man can handle. He dropped his head, locking his lips to hers, the ache and passion he'd been holding back, craving more from her. His bear took control, done with waiting. Lonnie had never been kissed like this. She'd never known anyone like Judge. His hands ran down her body, and shivers followed the trails his fingertips forged. He took hold of her top and pulled it upward gently. Could she do this? Yes. The answer to that question was ingrained in her mind, heart, body, and intuitive senses. She sighed her assent. She wanted him. She'd have to accept that. Right or wrong. Repercussions with the intuitive community. Ramifications with the compliance unit. She'd deal with all that later. His lips departed from hers for a fleeting nanosecond while he drew her top over her head. Before her lips could get cold or her mind and body could protest, he'd claimed her mouth again. He took control, helping himself. The fabric of his shirt rubbed against her flesh as he pulled her closer. She grabbed his shirt, the barrier that kept her flesh from his, and jerked twice, clumsily, her fingers fumbling with urgency and need. Let me help." There was a chuckle in his voice. Instantly and deftly he took the shirt off. She appraised the dark olive skin taut with muscles, wide chest devoid of hair, broad shoulders that tapered to a V. Judge pulled her close, his body hot against hers. Lonnie held him, as if there'd be no tomorrow. There will be no tomorrow. There can't be. She trailed her fingers on his chest and found his muscles flexed and hard beneath her touch. Gliding her hands lower, she felt his abdomen contract. Her nails raked the flesh, rewarded with a groan that came from deep within him and scorched Lonnie's desire and center. She'd wanted him for too long, denied this for what seemed an eternity. Achingly stiff and tender, with a need for Judge's touch, her nipples pushed at the lace fabric of her bra. She unhooked it with a snap and lowered it, relishing the way his eyes dropped to her rosy nipples, enjoying the way they reacted to his gaze, purling, tingling with an excitement clear to her mound. Beautiful. Damn. Just beautiful. Judge cupped her breasts, thumbing her nipples brusquely. The throbbing between her legs grew, moisture gathered. Her desire skyrocketed with his touch. I want you. You've got me. Right here. Right now. Forever. His voice was hoarse with passion as he tugged her pants down. Forever. First, that word sent the right kind of shiver through her. Then it sent the wrong kind. She was breaking the fundamental taboo of her people by being with him. Lonnie shoved the thought away. She'd deal with it later. He lay her back, spread her legs, then leaned forward and inhaled, his chest expanding with the breath. He ran his tongue over his lower lip, almost throwing her into a climax at the idea of his tongue on her, in her. His face neared her breast, then moved the short distance to take her nipple in his mouth. His 5 o'clock shadow was a coarse stroke, and a surge of electricity traveled to her core, lighting her on fire with an intensity that made her moan. I have to taste you. His tongue trailed between her breasts, then seared her skin as he drove southward. He spread her lips with his fingers, and the coolness of the air touched her heated flesh, causing her to tremble. Judge lowered his head, his breath warm, countering the cool air on her pussy, caressing her lips. A tremor traveled over her. He put his arms under her thighs, her legs hooked over his wide shoulders. She was fully exposed, and a feast for his bear's vision, even in the dimness. Knowing he was surveying her body and enjoying the slick pink and redness he found between her legs, watching his face as lust settled on it, making his dark eyes even darker, Lonnie moaned with need for Judge. Only Judge. Always Judge. He blew on her clit, making it spasm, making her legs jump. Please, Judge. She didn't even know what she was asking for. I aim to. God, yes. He drew in the swollen, sensitive button of her need, then licked her up from her ass to her sleekness with a long, deliberate swipe of his tongue. He reversed his path, letting just the tip travel the same distance, allowing it to penetrate her. Lonnie released a guttural groan, grabbing his head, bringing him closer. He plunged his tongue deeply inside, and a roar from his chest turned her on even more, drowning out the sound of her panting. He plunged his fingers into her while he sucked on her tender, swollen button and sent her into a turmoil. Her nails dug into his flesh, scoring it. She thrashed as a climactic wave overtook her, sending her off a cliff of bliss. Throwing her head back, she screamed her pleasure, sure the neighbors would hear. He kissed the inside her thighs, first one then the other, then covered her body with his. Breathing hard, unable to move, she lay in place, immobile and recuperating, fighting to catch her breath. His eyes glowed with his bear's amber-colored light. Lonnie locked her lips onto his, tasting herself, loving how her essences merged with his musky manliness. Boldly she reached down, cupped his hardness. Her breath caught in her throat. He was so very large. Judge rose, but she nudged him back and unzipped his pants, easing his length out. She appraised his thickness. Lowering her head, she touched the tip of her tongue to the large drop of moisture on the tip. His essence glided across her tongue. Lonnie paused, savoring Judge's flavor, relishing the earthiness and manliness of him. This only served to fire her desire all over again. She licked the rim of his engorged head. He released a groan that grew into a rumble, when she wrapped her lips around his cock snugly. She sucked until his rumble deepened into a growl. Enough. Judge grabbed her roughly, pulling her up his hard body. He captured her tongue into a kiss while she rolled and straddled his muscular body, his cock tucked against her slickness. Leaning back, Lonnie pushed off and rose, ready to slide onto his shaft. She dropped her body, impaling herself on his hardness. His thickness elicited a gasp and a cry as her body fought to accommodate his girth. She rocked on his cock, her breasts swaying close to his face. Judge reached for her breasts and cupped them, tweaking her nipples roughly, pulling and pinching, then rolling the hardened nubs between his fingers. Lonnie moved faster, in tempo with the passion he was pushing to a crescendo. Palms on his thick chest for leverage, she pushed herself up, then slammed herself down. Again. And again. Over and over. He released a low, long, drawn-out groan, grunted once, then flipped her with a swift wrestling-style move. With one fierce push he plunged in, filling, demanding, punishing, claiming. Lonnie pushed against him, taking him deeper, meeting him thrust for thrust. The intimacy of their merged breathing, the sounds of their sex, the smacking of skin against skin was too much. Starbursts appeared behind her closed lids like uber sparklers. Her body felt like it belonged to a wild, wanton woman. She dug her nails into the carpeting, climaxing with a long moan, biting on her lip to keep the frenzied scream that threatened to explode from her lungs. His grip on her hips was ferocious. He pulled her tightly against him and was still, while his cock pulsated streams of his passion deep within. Judge swept the hair on her neck aside, placing his lips on her nape. His breath was warm, his body hot against hers. She bit a sob back. I shouldn't have done this. How would she ever be able to work with him, day in, day out, without wanting him? Without sensing he wanted her. She sensed his bear's conviction that she was their mate. What she couldn't convey to him was how this couldn't happen. She couldn't disappoint her family, her community. She didn't swipe at the tear that made its way down her cheek. She didn't want him to know. The next morning, Judge woke feeling as if the largest piece of a puzzle had finally settled into place. He awakened Lonnie with a kiss on her shoulder. She'd leaned back, her body pressed into his. Then jumped up, a horrified look on her face. I can't do this. Then she grabbed clothing, half putting it on, half carrying it, and ran out, leaving behind a very confused, very naked Judge. With morning wood. Chapter 6. Judge snapped himself back to the moment at hand. Lonnie had just walked out on him. Again. Anger renewed itself in Judge. His bear roared in frustration, insisting they go after Lonnie. He opened the door as the engine of her car purred to life. He ran inside, grabbed his keys, and headed toward his vehicle. The sight before him drew him up short. A knife lay on the ground next to his tire. Next to his flat tire. Fuck. Admiration at her quickness in action and thought rose in him, even though she thwarted him. Behind her departing vehicle, dust gathered and settled. But she hadn't won this one. Not yet. Not by a long shot. This is my mountain. Judge gave his bear his way. The morphing was excruciating, but swift, thanks to his ability to shift adeptly. A few bone-crunching and sinew-tearing seconds later, he had shifted into his bear and was heading down the mountain at a breakneck lope. He could beat her down the mountain. She had to take all the curves. His path would be straight. Maybe a bit treacherous. Maybe a lot. But then he'd be at the third curve and could stand in front of her car. She'd have to stop. They'd talk. They had a lot to talk about. From her AWOL to Pepper, to why she left their unit and wouldn't respond to his calls. Yeah, we have a lot to cover. But right now, he had a lot of ground to cover. He barreled between trees, oblivious to the terrain and roots that reached upward, almost tripping him over and over. He was out of breath. His bear's heart beating mightily in his chest, he pushed on, saliva dripping from open jaws, unaware of the frightful sight he'd make to a human, this out-of-control rabbit-appearing bear. Tears blinded Lonnie's sight, making everything blurry, making the road precarious to careen down. She swiped at her cheeks. That did nothing to improve her vision. She should slow down, but the last thing she needed was to be close to Judge. His essence was still making her body vibrate in response, as though her intuitive senses were on high alert. Or as if he was getting closer. Impossible. She had to figure out how to help Pepper on her own, but right now, she needed to be as far from Judge as she could. Nausea rose in her tummy, knots and bile joined forces. She dry heaved, catching herself midway, swallowing nothing down. Damn it. She barely managed the words out when a large, brown, furry entity appeared in front of her. She tried to react. She swerved. She hit the brakes. She couldn't have said what happened had she overcorrected. Had her car underreacted. In the split second, she hit the entity, the grizzly. Large. Drooling. Red and orange glowing in its eyes. Something else was in its eyes. Lonnie didn't have the time to figure out what it was. Her car spun, refused to obey, and began a slide, ricocheting off a tree. Her head snapped in one direction, while it seemed her car went in another. With an unyielding snap, her temple slammed into the car's window. The world went dark, instantly shutting her off completely. Chapter 7. Judge froze. Lonnie slammed on the brakes, but the car clipped him just as she swerved, sending the vehicle hurtling into the trees on the wrong side of the mountain, the side facing downhill. He stumbled, his side felt like it was on fire. He fell forward on all fours, then crumpled briefly. His bear bellowed, rising onto unsteady paws. Lonnie's car dangled precariously off the ledge, held in place only by a few young trees. He loped, limping, to the driver's side of the car, shifting into his human form rapidly. Thankfully, his training as an enforcer allowed him to keep his proficiency at shifting. Too bad it didn't lessen the pain. Just made the process quicker, so the pain didn't last as long. He drew to a stop next to her car door. The side window had blood on it. She was slumped forward, unconscious. He tugged on the door. The car made a creaking sound, or maybe that was the trees. Her vehicle teetered, then settled back in. Not good. It could fall at any moment. He pulled on her door handle, opening it, and pushed her head backward, hoping he wouldn't create more damage from doing so. Blood dripped down her temple toward her cheek. He grunted as a stabbing pain seized near his ribs. He didn't have time for this shit. He needed to get her out of the car before it fell. Judge tugged her out of the car, glad she hadn't fastened her seatbelt. Then again, maybe that would have kept her from hitting her head. Another set of hands reached for her. He turned to look at the newcomer. "Lance," he grunted through the pain. "Step back. We'll get her." Cross stepped up, putting his hand on Judge's side. "No. I can't lose her." Judge groaned from the touch, though it shouldn't have hurt, not normally, not if he hadn't been hit by a speeding car. "Back," Lance called out. "Take care of Judge. He's bleeding." Judge peered down. Blood on his shirt. He glanced up. Mac, Lance's mate, was raising his shirt. Next to Judge, Lance and Cross had taken a still unconscious Lonnie out of her car. Not a moment too soon, as her car made a protesting groan and slid down the mountainside, rolling several times in an angled clearing, then landing with a thunderous thud. "What the hell is going on up here?" Cross's voice seemed loud to Judge's ears. Mac touched his rib. Judge grunted from the pain and pushed her hand away, shaking his head. "Take care of Lonnie." "I'm fine." Mac frowned at him. "You've always been too hard-headed for your own good." She turned toward Lonnie. Judge couldn't tear his eyes off Lonnie's pale face. "She'll be fine. Let's get her to the clinic though," Mac said. "I want to get an X-ray and check her vitals. She hit her head, maybe a concussion. We'll take her." She indicated toward Lance to get the oversized Suburban. "I'm riding with you," Judge announced. "Not a chance," Cross said. "You're riding with me and Ariadne. You have some questions to answer." You're crazy if you think I'm leaving her alone, Judge snapped at his older brother. He helped them get Lonnie in the car, reclining her in the extended cargo area Mac used for transporting. They laid a blanket beneath her. He crawled in next to her, favoring his injured side, then stretched out his legs in front of him, wincing as it pulled on the injury. As soon as he could be sure she was fine and safe with his brothers, he planned to go into a healing hibernation. Shouldn't take long if he could only get into his bear form and hibernate. It always amplified and accelerated healing. "What are you guys doing?" Judge asked. "You were headed toward my dragon's point." "Yeah, you called." Then cross-talked to Grizz. "He said he had a feeling that we should check on you." "Grizz has his fingers on the pulse of things more often than not," Judge grumbled. He didn't exactly mind that Grizz seemed to always predict when he or one of his brothers needed him, but how he knew was confusing to say the least. Lonnie moaned. Judge brushed her hair away from her face. "Lonnie, you're going to be okay." "I hope." Her eyes fluttered open, her pupils dilated, then her lids closed and opened. She focused on Judge's face. "What, who, where am I?" She tried to raise her head but dropped it again. She reached toward the bloody laceration. Judge caught her hand just in time and held it away from the injury. "You had an accident. We're taking you to Mac's clinic. She's going to do some tests. Take an X-ray." Lonnie's eyes widened. She wriggled, struggling to rise. "No. No X-ray." Judge frowned. "What's the big deal?" "I'm sure it's fine. Mac's good." "You don't know." "I can't." She panted, almost seemed to be hyperventilating. She jerked her arm up, striking his injured side. He flinched, fighting to keep the grimace of pain from his face. "Okay. Relax." What the hell was her problem with Mac checking her? He leaned back, closed his eyes against the pain. "Judge." Trying to keep his pain from ruling his senses, while also struggling to push his feelings for Lonnie back, Judge opened his eyes. "Yeah." She turned her head, and her face was almost touching his thigh. "You're hurt." "I'm okay." "That was you I hit. You're bear." "I didn't mean." "I know. I know you didn't. I'm okay, really. I'm an intuitive. You can't lie to me." He fought to keep his pulse even, although he wasn't sure if that was how she read his emotions. Pulse reading was how shifters ascertained another's fear, joy, sadness, as well other emotions. "Who said I'm lying?" "Judge." That single word came off her lips in a sigh. The sigh tugged at Judge's gut, at his heart, at his bare soul. Then the anger set in. She walked away. He turned his head toward the window. Damned if he'd let her see the emotions on his face. Moments later, or maybe forever later, they pulled up in front of Mac's clinic, part of the Bear Canyon Wildlife Reserve Mac was the head of. Judge helped Lance get Lonnie out of the vehicle, even though the effort made his side feel like he was being stabbed, over and over again. He gritted his teeth against the pain and put his arm around Lonnie. She was more important right now. She'd hit her head. Mac was already inside, a medical bag in her hand. "I can walk." Lonnie nudged herself away from Judge's hold. "I'm fine." "I'm sure you are." Mac had put on her best bedside manner. "Come in here." Lonnie gave her a wry smile. "I can't believe I'm being treated in a vet's office." She pointed to Judge. "He needs help. I hit him with the car." Mac snapped her head in Judge's direction. "Is that what happened?" Judge nodded, glaring at Lonnie for turning the attention away from her own needs. "It's no biggie. I can wait till you're done with Lonnie. I think." He leaned against the wall. "Bro," Lance whispered. "You don't look so hot." "I'm fine. Nothing a short hibernation heal won't take care of." Lance frowned. "If you say so. I'm going to make sure Mac's got this covered." Cross and Ariadne walked in just as Lance went into the examination room. Hey, called a tow truck and got her car pulled out of the trees. Cross glanced around. Where are they? Examination room. Judge indicated with his head. You're next. Cross's voice was firm. You're not looking good. And your pulse is getting weaker. I'm fine. Cross shook his head. You're not.
Chapter 8. Lonnie braced against the tightening of the blood pressure cuff. Why did they always have to get so tight? So you're Lonnie. Mac kept her eyes on the blood pressure monitor. Lonnie nodded. She didn't pick up any negative vibrations from the blonde with the clear cornflower blue eyes. You've heard of me? Mac nodded. Not until recently. Judge called Lance. Something about someone being AWOL. That's you? Lonnie nodded. Her intuitive senses said she could absolutely trust the blonde veterinarian. Why'd you go AWOL? Aren't there severe repercussions? She gave another nod. I had to. She flinched when Mac touched near the head injury. Hang on. A little sting. She dabbed at the spot. Though really it felt like she'd used a jackhammer on it. Ouch. She calls that a little sting. I'd hate to see a big sting. Sorry. Mac gave a sympathetic wince. You don't need stitches. Look here, please. Mac shone a light in her eye, then in the other eye. Hurting anywhere else? You were limping when you walked in. I have an X-ray machine here. No. No X-ray. Mac raised Lonnie's sleeve, tied a piece of elastic tubing over her bicep and took out a syringe. Just a little bit of blood. To be sure. That didn't seem normal, but Lonnie didn't even think about it until after it was done. So why are you AWOL? Why are you in Bear Canyon Valley? Word gets around, doesn't it? Small valley. Close-knit shifter community. You know how it goes. No, actually. I don't. How could she possibly get it? She was from a different community. The intuitives were more reserved, less likely to show emotions because they didn't need to show them. They felt what others were feeling. That was what attracted Lonnie to Judge, to the shifter ways. Expressing rage, love, anger, sorrow, all of those emotions she'd always felt like she had to control. For an intuitive, expressing emotions was like screaming. It just wasn't done. Not in public and rarely in private. That includes sex. Sex didn't seem to be anything like it had been with Judge. Loud, messy, sweaty, juicy, hot, full of pumping pulses, elevated blood pressure, heightened sensations. Well? Lonnie realized she'd been so lost in her own thought she hadn't answered Mac. Long story. I've got a few moments. Mac slipped her arm into a reach-in cooler and grabbed 2 bottled waters. She handed one to Lonnie. I don't have that much time. Give me the cliff notes. Persistent much. Lonnie bit back the sigh of exasperation. You never know, Mac said as if she could read Lonnie's mind. We may be able to help. Doubtful. Cliff notes, here we go. My best friend Pepper is missing. She's an intuitive, like me. You know what that is? Mac nodded. Lance told me. I do have some questions. They can wait though. She waved her hand for Lonnie to continue. Pepper freelances. She applied for the compliance unit when I did. Lonnie grimaced. She didn't make it. She blew a breath out. How could she sum up almost 4 years of Pepper's freelancing? Anyway, some of the organizations she works for. She shrugged. She has no business associating with those types. Like what types? Another grimace. This part was hard to tell. Pepper was a good person. She didn't engage in illicit activities. Like maybe criminal organizations. Mac took a long drink off the bottle, then wiped her lips with a tissue from the dispenser. Why does she do that? She didn't plan to. Guess she got involved with the guy. Mac nodded. Yeah, keep going. Didn't find out until later that he wasn't such a great guy. Shifter? A knock at the door interrupted Lonnie's response. Lance peeked his head in. "You're needed." Mac looked askance at him. "Right now?" "Yeah. In the back. Large animal bay." Mac started. "Now, babe." Lance took her by the hand. "Cross and Ariadne are back there now too." "This way." Mac nodded toward the door opposite the one they'd come in, clearly the one that led to the back. "I'll be back in a couple," she said to Lonnie. Lance followed Mac out. Lonnie stared at the closed door they'd just gone through. She waited for what seemed like an eternity, but couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. The silence and emptiness of the room got to her. She opened the door she'd come in, the one that led to the lobby, and glanced around. Empty. Where was everyone? Where was Judge? All she saw was a set of keys on the counter. I shouldn't. Chapter 9. A few hours later. As Lonnie drove to Denver, the signals from Pepper were intermittent, but when they came with an intensity that drove through Lonnie's mind with the fierceness of a migraine's lightning bolt. She'd parked the borrowed, stolen vehicle in the dilapidated parking area full of potholes and debris in the midst of an army of warehouses. The warehouse district was a ghost town. It was near dusk, and Lonnie's eyes were gritty from the lack of sleep. She opened the car door and stepped out, almost falling into one of the large potholes. The baby was giving her fits, making the nausea a constant rather than a sporadic issue. Dear God, let me find Pepper quickly and get her to safety. And find a place to shower. And food. Her stomach rumbled. Then a sharp pain jerked, low in her abdomen beneath her stomach. She lurched forward from the pain, then rested against the vehicle, leaning her forehead against the cool glass. Here we go. A piercing pain in her eye, worse than the one in her abdomen, pulled a shriek from her. She clapped one hand over her mouth while the other hand flew to her eye. Then the hand over her mouth began to burn. The pain of her eye, hand, and abdomen brought a low moan out of her. She rolled her back against the truck, then slowly lowered herself until she was sitting in potholes, crumbling asphalt and pebbles. The pain in her eye wouldn't subside. It was so strong, it made the pangs and aches in her abdomen seem non-existent. She closed her eyes against the agony and tried to concentrate on her breathing, anything to take her away from the pain. Here we go. Just like Clark said. Her eyes flew open. 3 men stood above her. Attired in jeans and khakis with t-shirts that pulled tightly across broad chests, they were appraising her as if she were a steak in a butcher's window. Who are you? Please help. I need to get to a hospital. We've got the right place for you. Before Lonnie could protest or react, she was blindfolded, gagged, and carried by one of them. His perspiration gave away countless unbathed days. Lonnie fought back the nausea the scent of him brought up. The sound of a door creaking open, and the sensation of a different environment, heralded a new smell. Dank mildew, stuffy. She knew she'd been taken into one of the warehouses. But which one? Did it matter which one? She scoffed at herself. She was set down roughly, her hands released. She pulled the blindfold off and jerked the nasty gag out of her mouth. Indignation had well set in. She studied the men surrounding her. The agony in her forehead was still prevalent, but it was interrupted by the sound of whimpering that came from behind the men. She craned her neck. Pepper? I'm sorry, Lonnie. I tried, I couldn't after I'm sorry. The men stepped aside. Lonnie clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from letting the horrific sight before her be expressed in a scream. Her mind was still desperate to release a scream, to let out the horror of what she was witnessing. Beneath her fingers, she bit her lip. Coagulated blood had made a crimson trail of tears from one of Pepper's eyes down her face, neck, and left its mark on her top. Blood still seeped down, albeit slowly. Lonnie couldn't tell if her eye was missing or injured. She cringed inwardly. Now she knew where the searing pain she'd experienced had come from. Her connection to Pepper was so strong, Lonnie's body had experienced reflections of Pepper's pain. Remembering the pain in her hand, Lonnie glanced at Pepper's hand. Bloody. A gaping wound on the back of her hand that seemed to go through her palm. What the hell happened to her? Lonnie leapt to her feet and ran to Pepper. She wrapped her arms around her friend's shaking shoulders. Sobs racked Pepper's body. Lonnie squeezed her tighter and looked at the men watching them. She needs a doctor. The men were unmoving, staring at her. Now damn it. Call 911. From behind the men came the sound of laughter. One man's laughter. Eerie, the sound filled the room and bounced off the walls. Slowly, each of the men began to laugh in sync with the unnatural laughter. A man stepped from behind the men, the source of the laughter. He was tall, thin to the point of being gaunt, attired in all black, with short black hair slicked back. His face was pale with deep-set black eyes. He stopped laughing, thin lips curving into a tight-lipped smile. If she only had one name to give him as a description, Lonnie would have chosen the word gravedigger. Nice of you to join us, Miss Myers. The depths of his eyes flashed a light blue color in their depths. Join us? What the hell is he talking about? That didn't matter now. Only Pepper's injuries mattered. My friend needs a doctor. She'll survive. His tone was cold. Take them to the holding area. Moments later, Lonnie and Pepper were alone in a room that had no windows, and a huge padlock on the outside of the door. Lonnie had noticed the lock as she'd walked into the room. She studied her surroundings. A ratty, filthy, dingy warehouse. Dark walls covered with dust, grime, and who knew what. The flooring was crude concrete. A chair and a makeshift bed sat against the far wall, makeshift because it was a board on top of several milk crates with a bunch of blankets on top. No comfort. Unsanitary. Rumpled t-shirts lay strewn across the blankets. Let's get that covered for now. Lonnie picked out the cleanest of the shirts and ripped it in half. She wrapped one part across Pepper's eye, making a provisional eye patch, careful not to touch the injury, hoping her vision in that eye could be saved. She wrapped the other half around Pepper's hand. What happened to you? Why are you here? Pepper sniffled. Thank you. That creep is an elemental. He made an ice storm, shooting icicles at me. God. Why? He wanted me to tell him where you were. When I wouldn't, he said he knew how to get you here, that he'd use our connection and my pain would bring you. He shot icicles at my eyes. One, she heaved a breath that was closer to a sob. One of those ice projectiles did this. Her uninjured hand waved toward the patch. The next icicle was headed toward my other eye, but I managed to stop it. She held up the wounded hand. Why? Why would they do that? They are collecting intuitives for... Lonnie groaned. By the time the second groan had exited her mouth, she had doubled over. A flash of heat traveled over her body. She reached for the wall for support. Lonnie. Pepper put an arm around her. What is it?
Chapter 10. Judge inhaled. Then it hit him. Holy hell. He was in his bear. He didn't remember shifting. He didn't remember anything. A low grumbling growl rumbled in his chest. He shook his bare head. He inhaled again. Hay. Why did he smell hay? He pushed his bear back, trying to take over his body. His bear protested. I'm pretty sure I've healed enough. Judge shoved harder, wrestled control from his bear, and pushed his body back toward his human form. A few short seconds later, after grueling discomfort, bones compacting, sinew morphing, he was in his human form. Out. Fucking straw poked at his body. Where's my shirt? Shifters didn't lose their clothing when they shifted. They just got rumpled, looking like the shifter had been in a wrestling match. So where the hell was his shirt? About time, Rumpelstiltskin. Judge studied his surroundings. He'd been in the back of Mac's vet clinic before. He knew about the large animal bays. He turned toward his brother. What the hell, Cross? You passed out, bro. Internal bleeding. We all brought you back here, Had you hibernate to heal? You don't remember any of it. He sure as hell didn't. Judge shook his head. Not a bit. Lance was next to Cross. Hey, Mac. He's up, he called out. Judge forked his fingers through his hair. How long was I out? Cross glanced at his watch. About half a day. Then it hit him. Where's Lonnie? Cross frowned. Stole my new truck. Shit. How the hell will I find her now? Then the place turned into Grand Central Station, it seemed. Mac came in and right behind her, Ariadne. Judge rose to his feet, scanned the room for his shirt. No luck. After that, surprise. Cruz walked in. You really do know when to show up, don't you? Judge muttered, half under his breath. A woman followed Grizz into the room. One he didn't recognize. Judge studied the newcomer. Okay, truth be told, he stared. Long white blonde hair. Light blue eyes, almost indistinguishable from her whites, they were so light. Her skin was a dusky color, offsetting the eeriness of her eyes. She wore a long white gown that flowed to her ankles. She stared at Judge, her gaze not wavering. She didn't say a word, had no expression on her face. Judge finally turned to Grizz, an eyebrow quirked. Grizz glanced at the woman, then at Judge. You need an intuitive for your intuitive. Meet Sierra. My intuitive? Hardly. But he couldn't say that. Jesus. Do you know everything that goes on around here? How the hell does he know about Lonnie? He looked at Sierra, the intuitive. Lonnie was the only intuitive he'd ever known. Intuitives were a private, closed-off society. Anyway, she's gone. He kept his eyes on Sierra. Unless you can find her. Those eyes never left his face. Why do you shifters always assume this? That reminded him of something Lonnie had said once, long ago. Sadness pierced him. So basically I'm screwed? I won't be able to find her. You underestimate me, little bro. Cross took his phone out, pressed on the screen. I've got tracking on it. He put his arm around Ariadne. I can't afford to take any chances, not with. He locked eyes with his attractive, curvy mate. Can I share? Ariadne nodded. There's a baby on the way. More than one, Mac added. No, Cross countered. We've already seen Doc. He confirmed Ariadne is only carrying one. I'm not talking about Ariadne, Mac corrected. You? Cross asked. Ariadne squealed in delight. Lance frowned. This is the first I'm hearing of this. No. Hold on. Mac laughed. Not me. Lance did a double take. WH. Lonnie's pregnant. That's why she wouldn't let me do any x-rays. I drew blood. Tested it. I figured out after she'd gone that she was pregnant. Judge leaned against the wall. Could it be? It had to. Didn't it? I need to find her. Now. Is the baby yours? Cross asked. Of course it was his. Isn't it? Unless she found someone else, a part of his stomach shriveled up at the idea of that. He couldn't tell Cross anyway. Admitting that would be admitting to doing something against regulations. Don't ask, bro. Lance and Cross both frowned at him. Well, she's AWOL. Let me take care of that part, else she'll have hell to pay when the Shifter Council catches up to her. Relief flooded through Judge, then doubt set in. Can you? Lance laughed. Can he? Seriously? Then he turned to Cross. Have you not told him? Not yet. Told me what? Big Brother Cross has been offered a new position with the Shifter Council. He'll be the department head of all the Shifter Council compliance units. Judge did a double take, then settled his glance on Cross. No shit. Yeah. And you'd have to move to New York. They'll let me remote some of it from Bear Canyon. Wow. They must want you pretty badly to let you remote it. Cross shrugged. Congrats, bro. Judge gave him a quick shoulder hug. Now about Lonnie. Yeah, I'll take care of it. But there'll have to be some settling later. I'm sure. Judge hoped whatever penalties Lonnie would have to pay wouldn't be too steep, but right now, her well-being was way more important. So about finding her. Right. Cross nodded. My truck's in Denver. It's been parked in the industrial area since this morning. Not moved. Not been started. I had it disabled. I've got a team in the area, a couple of freelancers that do occasional work for the unit, and for me. They're on alert, monitoring the truck, but not doing anything otherwise. Judge didn't give a shit about the damn truck. And Lonnie. See, the thing is she got there before the team was in place. They're talking to the businesses and warehouses in the area to see if they can find anything out from any private surveillance cameras. I need to get to my truck. Can I hitch a ride? Judge pushed off the wall and headed for the door that led to the front of the clinic. Why don't you let all of us go with you? Cruz asked. Sierra may be able to help with Lonnie and her friend too. Cross's contacts will stay in touch with him. And you never know when you'll need a little extra manpower. He smiled, a growl coming from deep within his chest, his bear. Judge studied his uncle. He'd always thought Grizz was older, but now he didn't look as old as he had when Judge was a teen. Sure, shifters age very slowly, but why did Grizz appear closer in age to Judge than ever? Maybe his uncle had some special mojo, since he had friends who were other types of supernatural beings. Yeah, Lance agreed. We're not letting you go alone. Anyway, Lonnie's one of ours. She's with the compliance unit. Plus she's pregnant, Mac added. You never know when she might need medical help. Judge raised his hands in defeat. All right. Can we get going already? Mac stepped forward. You might want this. I had to take your shirt off you to check your wounds. She handed him one of Lance's shirts. Judge nodded his appreciation and slipped his arms into the sleeves. I'll drive, Lance said. We'll take Mac's truck. It'll hold all of us. Should be there in 5 hours, max. Mac grabbed her doctor kit. Judge gave her a look. You never know, she said. I'd rather be prepared. He nodded, hoping she didn't mean that to include Lonnie. They piled into the Suburban. Let's take the back, Mac said to Ariadne. I have some catching up to do with Sierra. Lance drove, Judge sat shotgun. Cross and Grizz piled in behind them. The three women situated themselves in the very back. Don't drive slow, Judge cautioned. Or I'll have to take over. When have I ever driven slow? Lance laughed. Let's find your girl. Who said she's my girl? Who am I kidding? But Judge wasn't ready to admit his feelings, not out loud. Not to his enforcer brothers. Lance looked him up and down. Cross chuckled. You saying she's not? That it's not your baby? Judge knew, as surely as his bear knew, the baby could be no one else's. And even if it weren't his, Lonnie was still his. And her child would be his. As soon as I can find her. Yeah, and from what she told Mac, it seems her friend could be in trouble. Which means Lonnie could be in trouble too. Lance briefed him on a talk Lonnie had with Mac before he'd passed out. That Lonnie's friend Pepper was mixed up with unsavory characters. That she was in trouble. That Lonnie had gone AWOL to find and help her. Judge was furious with her for so many reasons, but a part of him beamed with admiration for Lonnie. I need to find my mate. He'd never met anyone so mysterious and deep, so hard to understand. And at the same time, so exciting. Unintentionally, his shifter hearing picked up a conversation in the back of the vehicle. Curiosity piqued, Judge paid attention, tuning everything else out. I thought intuitives didn't interact with shifters, Mac was saying, in almost a whisper in the farthest seat in the back. Not usually. Judge recognized Sierra's voice. But Sierra's my cousin, Grizz said. Judge turned toward the back, pretense at eavesdropping over. He was curious now. How is Grizz related to an intuitive? Grizz continued, she told me to check on you guys. If it weren't for her intuitive senses, I'd have never known every time there was a ripple in your lives. Judge looked at Lance. Lance was peering at Cross in the rearview mirror. Judge glanced at Cross. Cross shrugged. Okay then, appears we're all surprised by this. So how are you related, exactly? And what is she doing here, among shifters? Grizz glanced at the back seat. You mind? Judge caught a glimpse of Sierra, nodding. Grizz turned forward, facing Judge. She's my cousin, a few times removed. An outcast intuitive, one-quarter shifter. Her grandmother was a grizzly shifter. Though he was half shifter, her father had no shifting animal. He met Sierra's mother, an intuitive. Well, that's another story. Anyway, Sierra's mother saved his life. The intuitive community has never been accepting of outsiders, so when Sierra's mother was pregnant, the two had to make a decision. They eloped and left the intuitive community behind. Sierra is not accepted by the intuitive community, and she isn't a shifter, though descended from one. Grizz glanced back. So far so good. Sierra's head appeared next to the headrest. You covered the stuff that matters. Judge imagined there was much more to her story. He hoped one day he'd get to hear it. So you helped Grizz? Judge asked her. Her light eyes looked eerie, almost completely white. When I can. He helped me, after all. I owe him. Grizz reached back, put his large hand over her smaller one. You keeping tabs, girl? You don't owe me. And if you ever did, don't you think all you've done for my nephews more than made up for it? Who's keeping tabs now? Sierra smiled, her expression changing, becoming less ethereal, more human. And you were helping him when you pulled your little magical tattoo trick on me. Mac's tone was playful, and her smile wide as she teased Sierra. I was. I'd like to think I was helping you as well. You were. Mac wrapped her arms around Sierra. You were. Agreed. Lance glanced in the rearview mirror, a smile on his lips. How do you think you can help with Lonnie? Judge asked, eager to get back to the woman he couldn't stop thinking of, same as his bear. Do you think being an intuitive will give you an edge? There's no way to know. Not yet, is there? Her response was mysterious. Chapter 11. Denver, Colorado. Just after dawn. The sun was shining a brilliant spring promise, but for Judge there was uncertainty. He had to find Lonnie. He'd asked Sierra repeatedly during the drive if she'd sensed the proximity of another intuitive, and she told him, over and over again, there was no way to know if she felt one, because, until they were closer, any intuitive signal would interfere. Frustrated, Judge had growled, but not realized he'd done it aloud until she went on to explain. It's not like we all have a specific wavelength. Turn left here. Cross was holding his phone and giving Lance directions toward his vehicle. Still hasn't moved? Judge gritted his teeth. Nope. Cross reached up, put his hand on Judge's shoulder. Judge tried to relax his muscles. He knew he was one tense knot of anger and frustration. Less than a block away, Cross told Lance. Judge studied the area. One after another, all of the warehouses looked the same, lined up like barracks or prisoners. Dingy gray, lacking paint, with empty pallets that had begun to fall apart in front of otherwise empty truck bays. The warehouse alleys were all deserted. Probably because it's Saturday. Lance pulled the Suburban next to a new white SUV. Judge turned to Cross. Yours? Yup. Judge scanned the area. Where the hell could she be? He looked toward the back. Sierra's eyes were closed. A frown of concentration brought her brows down, leaving the skin between her eyes with vertical lines. She titled her head to the left, as if listening. Finally, Judge couldn't wait anymore. Well? Her eyes flew open. Please give me a moment. I can't concentrate on finding her when your emotions are sending tidal waves that are taking precedence over my senses. Lance gave him a look. Chill, bro. Judge gritted his teeth. Would he say chill if it was Mac? I'm chill. He glanced at Cross, who was pressing numbers on the phone screen. Cross put the phone to his head. We're here. He paused. Okay, I wondered if you had eyes on us. Sure. See you in a moment. He ended the call, then informed everyone, they're coming. Who is they exactly? Judge asked. 4 brothers. Wolf shifters. They hire out freelance. Qualifications. He wasn't about to put Lonnie's fate in the hands of amateurs. The best. I'm leaving it at that. Their resumes are need to know. I'm thinking I need to know. Trust me. Cross's dark eyes had a steely glint, his bear flashed amber in their depths. Judge let out a ragged, deep breath. He nodded. Cross had never let him down. 4 men approached, stocky but not bulked up. They had the eyes of predators, the stealth of a large feline. Their gaits had the confident swagger of one at the top of the food chain. Judge assessed the men, noting the weapons clearly attached to their bodies beneath their khaki pants and canvas shirts. All 4 wore sunglasses, all 4 had military haircuts. He glanced at Cross, wanting to gauge his brother's expression. Cross nodded. They're the best. Lucky they were in the area. Cross, Lance, Grizz, and Judge stepped out of the vehicle. The wolf shifters joined them. Grizz. The head of the wolves nodded. Judge looked from his uncle to the head wolf. Was there anyone Grizz didn't know? Range. Long time. Grizz nodded a greeting. Cross. The wolf called Range held his hand out to Cross. I heard there's talk you're moving up. Cross shook his head, disbelief plastered on his face. I don't know how the hell you know the stuff you do. The wolf shifter's smile was cryptic. Lance Judd. He looked at each respectively, clearly aware who was who. Judge realized the shifter must have a database, complete with photos, if he recognized him and Lance so easily. I'm Range. That's Asa, Jason Davin. He pointed to the 3 shifters behind him. Anything? Cross asked. Sign of our intuitive? No. Several male humans. An elemental. 1 leopard shifter. Not sure what type the elemental is. They're not onto you, right? Lance asked. A small derisive laugh slipped from Range, his granite-cast face not showing any emotions. You fellas have tranks? Grizz inquired. Don't leave home without 'em. Range's grin was wolfish. Got our hands on some high-priced anti-tranks too. The truck door opened. Sierra stepped out and walked up. Mac and Ariadne behind her. Sierra put one hand to her temple, rubbed gently. She's in there. I can feel an intuitive. Maybe 2. She paused, cocked her head. Could be 3? Is that a 3rd? It's so faint. Mac leaned in. The baby, she whispered. It could be, Sierra agreed. We don't want to advertise our presence early. No one seems to come this way, but you never know. Range glanced around. What's the plan? Judge was ready to get going. Does anyone have one? He looked from Cross to Range. Wait. Sierra held her hand up. Wait. Panic laced her voice. There's distress. Pain. I sense distress and pain. Like what? The cold fingers of fear gripped Judge's heart in a vice. I can't tell. Her eyes, such a light and transparent blue, now flashed metallic silver. We have to help them, her. I'm going now. Judge stepped forward. We're with you, Range said. Lance, Cross, stay. Don't jeopardize your positions with the compliance unit, Grizz said. I'll go with Judge. You stay and take care of Ariadne, Sierra, and Mac. No. Mac shook her head. Lonnie might need me. The baby, I'm coming. I'm going too, Sierra announced. You may need me. Grizz scoffed. Hard-headed, he said, but gave the women a look of admiration. Let's go. Mac's not going without me. And I'm not worried about the compliance unit. Unlike Cross, I don't see a future there for me. Which building? Cruz asked. Range pointed to the second one on the right. Last time you saw activity. Last night when they sent one guy out for dinner. Any idea how many men? Cruz pressed on. Not for sure, but we've been listening to heart rates. I'd say about a dozen. Judge looked at their guys. With the 4 wolves, Lance and Grizz, there were 7 of them. Cross must have been thinking the same thing. He opened his mouth. Grizz put a hand up. You need to stay here with Ariadne and the baby. Hell, I'd rather you two drove away, but I know you won't. I can't leave you guys to take care of this alone. You need to take care of your mate and the young'un she's carrying. Grizz smirked. Anyway, in your new position, you won't be out in the field. Get used to it. You're right, I know. A small snarl slipped out of Cross. Doesn't mean I have to like it. Sure doesn't, Grizz agreed. But still. Yeah, I get it. We'll wait in the vehicle. Keep an eye on Judge. He's tied into this one emotionally. Judge glared at his brother. Hey, I'm right here. Quit talking like I'm not. Range indicated a side door on the warehouse. That's the best point of entry. Judge glanced at Grizz, hoping his endorsement of the wolf shifters was merited. Grizz caught the look, gave him a nod of understanding, then leaned in. They're the very best. You got to trust me, son. He patted Judge on the back, his hand lingering. Judge wanted to lean against the man who was the closest thing to a father he'd ever had. Trust me. Another pat. Then Grizz turned to Range. Let's roll. One day, he'd have to ask Grizz how he managed to stay so well connected. And where the hell on the mountain range he lived, because he came to the rescue mighty quick. Every damn time.
Chapter 12. Too many hours had passed in the damn dingy excuse of a prison cell. Lonnie was locked in with Pepper. No one had checked on them. No one had stopped by to speak, though Lonnie could sense several presences outside the door. Guards. Damn. She fought the wave of discomfort traveling over her body. She didn't want to admit to herself what she knew deep inside. That discomfort was labor. This can't be. I'm only 7 months along. One solitary tear of anger made its way down her face. This is not what I pictured childbirth would be like. Not at all. Then a thought she didn't want to think occurred to her. What if the baby wasn't okay? I need a doctor. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead and upper lip. Funny how she felt them pop up on her skin. She took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. I have no idea what the hell I'm supposed to be doing. The only things she knew about childbirth were whatever she'd read or seen on TV. I'm so screwed. Please let my baby be okay. A low moan came out with her next breath. She couldn't help it. Pepper rose. She'd been sitting in the only chair in the room, next to Lonnie, cradling her injured hand and putting up a brave front, though Lonnie was sure she was in agony. Pepper's sympathetic eye rested on Lonnie's face. One eye. The other was covered in the now blood-covered t-shirt strip. Pepper had been brave. She had refused to give the elemental any information about Lonnie. She'd refused to send out any signals that would bring Lonnie to her assistance. So he tortured her, injured her, causing her to involuntarily send signals that led Lonnie right into their hands. Another wave of pain washed over her. Pepper took her hand, clearly feeling Lonnie's discomfort with her intuitive senses. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. Yes, it is. She clenched her lips into a flat line. I thought Reno was a good guy. Reno? The shifter. He's a leopard. He works with the elemental. His name is Clark. I don't understand. Reno hired me. After I didn't get into the compliance unit, I freelanced, mostly for police departments around the country. Then I was approached to do some work for a large corporation. Reno worked for them. I didn't know what they were. She dropped her head into her hands, tears muffling her voice. I fell in love with Reno. Now I know it was one-sided. Then I was blinded by love. When he started asking about the intuitive community, of course, I didn't tell him anything. I wouldn't break protocol. But I couldn't help but brag about you. Sob. I was so proud of you. Another sob. I guess that put you on their radar. Reno kept asking when he'd get to meet you. I told him you were busy with your work at the compliance unit. Pepper looked up. Tears streaked the blood and grime on her face. I know you didn't tell on purpose. Lonnie motioned for Pepper to come close. She patted the blanket next to her. I know you wouldn't hurt me. Look at what torture she went through to protect me. Pepper sat next to her. Why do they want me, you, us? We'll be sold to the highest bidder. Anyone who wants an intuitive. That's ridiculous. Pain forced Lonnie's words out in pants. I'll get us out of here. I will. Somehow. She cocked her head. You're pregnant. You never told me. I didn't know at first. And now? What's wrong? I'm AWOL. I'm pregnant with the shifter's baby. Everything's wrong. Except this baby is the rightest thing I can imagine. Pepper gasped. A shifter's baby. AWOL. You'll be exiled. I know. What will you do? Lonnie glanced at their surroundings pointedly. I think I have a different set of problems to deal with right now. She glanced at her abdomen.
Chapter 13. Judge waited while one of Range's wolf shifters fiddled with the lock. He couldn't see what the shifter was doing exactly, but within seconds, the door opened without a sound. Range raised his hand, then indicated to his shifters they should head in one direction. He motioned for Judge, Lance, and Grizz to follow him in another. Mac and Sierra stayed behind them. Silently, with great stealth, they made their way inside. The warehouse was partitioned with metal and wood dividers that separated the large area into smaller rooms and cubicles. Where the hell are you, Lonnie? He fought to keep his growing anxiety from impacting his performance, but this was his mate and their child, goddammit. Judge let out a long breath with a silent whoosh. They made a circle, scanning every room, opening closed doors, encountering no one. That couldn't be. His shifter senses picked up heart rates, but he couldn't pin where they were. Then he heard it. Low grunts and moans broke through the silence. Human hearing wouldn't pick it up, but his shifter senses were supernatural, catching the soft sounds. Lonnie, he whispered to the rest of the team. Slow down. There are more heartbeats than hers and her friends. Males. Range frowned. Humans. Judge's bear growled deeply in his chest. The bear wanted this badly. Judge had no intention of denying his bear. He and the bear had been the best of friends since he joined the CU as an enforcer. The training they'd been through had made them work in lockstep. His bear didn't even need to think something for Judge to be on board with it immediately. Judge acquiesced, yielding his body and will to the power of the bear. Have at it. Amongst the Del Cruz brothers, Judge had always been the most adept at shifting. It took him less than 5 seconds and was almost completely soundless as his bear's tendons and frame stretching, pulling itself over his own body. The bear's sinew morphed, the muscles bulked. In his bear form on all fours, Judge raised his bear head and sniffed, his black snout twitching. Blood. In his mind he saw red, ready to seek retribution. Silently his bear padded forward, taking the lead. Within less than a minute, he was in front of 2 husky humans, both males, standing guard in front of a door. The humans' jaws dropped at the sight of a huge grizzly stalking toward them. The men were definitely professional. They recovered quickly and raised weapons. Claws bared, Judge swatted his paw at the first man. Before he could raise the weapon, complete with a silencer, the man had parallel gashes across his chest, his stomach ripped open, and a horrified expression on his face. The man looked at the gaping wounds, then collapsed against the wall. The second man raised his weapon and got one round off before Judge's razor-tipped claws made short work of him. Fury and the sting of the round infuriated Judge's bear. Judge buried his canines into man's shoulder, bearing down the full weight of his strong jaws. Gurgling sounds came from the man as he struggled to take his last breaths. Judge shook his head, flinging the man against the wall where he lay in a lifeless heap. Judge shifted into his human form more quickly than he'd ever shifted before. Range had already made short work of the lock on the door, taking the heavy padlock out of the loop. Judge muscled past Range into the small room. Lonnie. Her name was a whisper on his lips. She was on a bed made of blankets and milk crates. She was pale, perspiration on her forehead, and her face was a mask of pain. "Judge," she groaned. "Judge." A woman sat next to her, holding her hand. The woman had a swath of fabric over her head, covering one eye and another on her hand. Both were stained with dry, darkened blood. "What the hell happened here?" "I'm Pepper," the woman said. "Lonnie's in labor. I don't want to lose my baby." Lonnie's voice was a whimper of a plea. "Our baby," Judge said, half a question in his tone. Lonnie nodded. "Our baby. Your Judge?" A strained smile came to Pepper's face. "She never doubted for a second you'd find her. I wasn't sure you'd make it before she gave birth. She needs medical attention." "That's me." Max stepped into the room, confident, ready, bag in hand. "I'll take care of this part of it." Grizz peeked his head in the door. "Range and I are going to find the rest of them. You and Lance got this." Judge nodded, not taking his eyes off Lonnie. "You bet," Lance answered. "We'll be back when we clear this building and get to the bottom of this." With that, Grizz and Range were gone. "We'll stand outside." Lance ushered Judge out of the room. "I should stay with her. What if anyone?" "You're right. I'll stand guard with you." They found Sierra standing outside the room. "How is she?" Judge had completely forgotten about Sierra. "She's in labor." "I sense that. She could probably use another friend. And I'm sure Mac would like an extra hand." He didn't say it, but his mind went there. Since Pepper only has one working hand, after all. "How far along is she?" Lance asked Judge as they stepped out of the room. 7.5 months. Judge could have counted the minutes if he'd needed to.
Chapter 14. Tears welled in Lonnie's eyes. She'd heard Lance's question and Judge's answer. She couldn't help the smile at his response and the emotions in his voice. A smile brought the tears flowing. Sweat was accumulating on her forehead. She felt gaze on her, then she realized she'd been so involved in Judge and Lance's conversation she'd completely overlooked that someone had stepped in the room. A blonde woman in a long dress with light eyes stared at her. Intuitive. The muscles in Lonnie's abdomen tightened, at the same time panic set in. An intuitive, one who would tell about her baby. About her failure in the compliance unit, that Lonnie had brought shame to her community. She swallowed the fear. "I can't. I'm not supposed. An intuitive cannot have a shifter's baby." "Not to worry, Lonnie. I'm a friend." The light eyes flickered with sympathy. "I'm Sierra, related to Grizz on my father's side." "You're an intuitive." Lonnie didn't mean to make it sound like an accusation. Sierra stepped forward. "I'm half intuitive. The other half is shifter and human. Your baby will be fine. I'll be exiled from the community. As was my mother. And as am I. You will make it. Have faith, sister. You don't understand. I'll have nowhere to go. And now I'm AWOL." Pepper took Lonnie's hand in her good hand. "You're not alone." "Indeed." Sierra took Lonnie's other hand. "And there is Judge." "Judge." His name came out on a sigh. "He's the father. He'd never let his baby down. He'd never let you down. But I let him down. He'd never want me back. Though her heart ached to be his again. To have the easy friendship, the underlying chemistry she couldn't deny. She winced, then let a cry out. She needs to get to a hospital. Pepper squeezed Lonnie's hand. She's going to deliver. Now, Mac said. I don't think there's time to do anything but deliver the baby, given the circumstances. Don't worry. Sierra's light-colored eyes drew Lonnie in. Lonnie knew what Sierra was doing. She was using one of the intuitive skills to ease her discomfort, to mind control the pain away. In order to work, the recipient had to be willing. God, am I ever willing? Another labor contraction ripped through her. Not only did Sierra manage to erase the pain, she made it so time stood still. 1 minute Lonnie was in the throes of labor, the next she heard a baby's cry. She raised her head. Mac held the baby up. A boy. Small but a healthy little bugger. The door opened. Judge peeked his head in. His face lit up. I thought I heard something. Sure, Mac said with a laugh. As if you didn't hear that, with your shifter hearing. You're a daddy. Naked and messy from the birth, the baby screamed angrily in her hands. Someone's hungry. A tiny roar interrupted her. The baby had begun to shift into a little bear. Jesus. Mac peered down at the tiny one, an expression of consternation crossing her features. This can't be normal, can it? Judge stepped closer. It is for Del Cruz babies. Our family tends to do that. He laughed. Scares the hell out of midwives and OB-GYNs, he reached out. Mind if I do? Mac had swaddled the baby in one of the t-shirts on the bed. She looked at her, as if asking permission. Lonnie appreciated the gesture, but Judge was his father. She nodded. I have a son. Judge's voice was filled with awe. Lonnie had loved Judge for years now, but she'd never loved him as much as when she witnessed the love he had for their baby. He glanced up at her, and his expression stayed the same. Lonnie wished it could mean that he loved her, but she knew it had to be from looking on the baby. We did this. He stepped to the bed. Placed the baby in her arms. This is us. There's no better way to define it. He was right. There was no better way. She leaned in and kissed the baby on his forehead. He'd completely returned to his human form, but his temples were scattered with tiny baby fuzz. Mac stepped away from the bed, Sierra followed her. They stood in the corner with Pepper. Lonnie heard them talking about Pepper's wounds and getting her medical help, but it sounded as if they were far away. It was as if she were in a parallel universe, where the only things that existed were Judge and the baby. The baby. Judge? He needs a name. Guess he does. Thoughts? I'll leave that up to you. Totally. How about Larson? Larson? That was a name out of the blue. Judge pulled up the only chair and sat next to her. He told her a story about his uncle Grizz, a grizzly shifter, his father killed by his own brother, about Cross being the son of that dead brother, a hatred between Cross's bear and Lance's bear. Her head was spinning by the time he'd recounted the story. So you want to name the baby after your uncle, Grizz? Yeah. He's out there in the warehouse now with a couple of wolf shifters, looking to eradicate the threat to us. To the baby. Lonnie nodded. Larson was a nice name. What will we call him, so there's no confusion? There won't be any, no matter what we call him, because my uncle goes by Grizz. Lars it is then. She paused. Judge. About the baby. Life. Where he grows up. I guess there are a few things we need to talk about. You have every reason to hate me. Hate you.
Chapter 15. Judge stared at Lonnie. Hate her. He could never hate her. That'd be like hating the most vital part of himself. I couldn't. He'd been about to say he couldn't ever hate her when she raised her hand. Lars will need someone, because She swallowed a gulp that sounded as difficult to swallow as if she had a bar of soap in her throat. I don't know what sort of repercussions I'll have to face for going AWOL. Another gulp. And I can't take the baby back to my community. You don't understand. He placed 2 fingers over her lips. As to the AWOL, Ross is taking care of that. As to the baby, you don't think I'd want him to be anywhere I wasn't, do you? I won't fight you for custody of this baby. There's no need to fight. You're my mate. End of story. He clenched his jaw, muscles working. She better not say no. Hell, he had no idea what he'd do if she did. Kidnap her. And Lars. That's what I'll do. Even after what I did. Even after. Always. Lonnie's lids grew heavy. Although she tried, the emotional upheaval she'd been in the last few days, coupled with pregnancy and childbirth, she couldn't keep her eyes open. There was a knock on the door. A shifter she didn't recognize poked his head in. Got a minute, Judge? His eyes landed on the baby. Holy shit, he muttered under his breath with a low whistle. Judge placed a kiss on her forehead. She wrapped her arms around Lars. He was closing his eyes as well. Sleep, Judge said. Maybe just a short while. She couldn't have stayed awake if she'd wanted to. Chapter 16. Judge stepped out of the room, joining Grizz, Range, and Lance. The shit I miss when I'm off capturing and killing bad guys, huh? Grizz had a huge grin on his face. Judge looked at Grizz. I have a son. Healthy. Roaring. His name is Larson. He even tried to shift. Larson. Grizz paused. He turned his gaze away, tilted his head to the left as if he were trying to regain his composure. Yeah. After some cantankerous motherfucker. Judge waggled his brows. You're a punk. Grizz seized him in a true bear hug, crushing Judge's ribs. I can't believe. Damn boy. I'm honored. We're lucky as hell to have had you around, Lance added. What did I miss with the bad guys? Judge directed his question at Range. Mostly because Range's clothing was blood-splattered. One of my men took a few hits. He'll be fine after we get him to a place where he can hibernate heal. What happened? Where are the rest of your guys? None of the humans made it out alive. Seems the elemental was willing to risk their lives. The shifter and the elemental were tranked. We've got them bound and blindfolded. Okay, Judge got the whole bound thing, but why blindfolded? The elemental casts ice bolts. Blindfolded the shifter because he was trying to feed directions to the elemental as to where to cast those bolts. They're the size of a 9mm round. And damned lethal. Fucking almost took out Jason. Judge grimaced in sympathy. Where are they? In a room at the other end of the warehouse. I'll keep tranking him in small dosages until I run out of tranks. That keeps him from blanketing the area with bolts. He can only cast a few in the near vicinity. Why the hell did they do this? They thought selling intuitives for their skills would be a good idea. Judge shook his head. Who was the mastermind behind this? It needs to be nipped. Both the shifter and the elemental. Jointly. The Wolves will be taking the shifter to New York to stand trial before the shifter Supreme Court. I want to see the bastards who were trying to sell my mate. Grizz looked at Lance. Lance said, you think that's wise? Wise or not? Judge's tone brooked no argument. He'd see them. Let's go. Grizz and Range led him down the narrow, filthy walkways. A few minutes later, the trio stepped into a room with high, bare warehouse ceilings and one window placed just inches below the roofline. Two of Range's wolf shifters were in a corner, under what appeared to be a shelter made of corrugated steel. A sliver of the morning sun shone through, casting a ray of light that split the room in two. Approaching the two captives tied to chairs, Judge stepped across the light. Someone's here. He crossed the light. A skinny, black-clad, blindfolded man facing him said, cocking his head as if trying to gather more information. A rumbling sound started. The window rattled. "Duck," Cruz yelled. "Under there." He pointed to the shelter in the far corner. Cruz darted toward the shelter, Range on his heels. A barrage of bolts of ice like stalactites came raining down. "Fuck." Range grabbed his shoulder. Blood poured from between his fingers. "Fucker got me. God damn it." Another bolt slammed into the top of Range's hand, pinning it to his shoulder. The trio zigged and zagged, making it across the large room and under the shelter. Under the makeshift protection, two of Range's wolves leaned against the wall. "Motherfucker's at it again," one said. "He needs another dose of trank," the other wolf shifter added. "Fuck that. I'm almost out, and we need some for emergencies before we can restock." Pain distorted Range's voice. The sound of the bolts pounding on the tin roof was louder than the hail when he'd been trapped in a barn when he was a kid. Abruptly, the barrage of icicles stopped, an eerie, hollow laughter replacing it. The dark-haired elemental had flung his head back, cackling like a madman. "He's going to kill one of us." One of Range's wolves unholstered a pistol. "I'm not having that." "Take him out, Asa." "Take the motherfucker out," Range ordered. Asa strode out of the shelter's protection with stealthy, silent steps and stopped within a few feet of the elemental. Range followed closely behind him, blood still flowing from his wounds. Asa raised the weapon, his gun arm steady. One loud burst of noise, and in the center of the blindfold, right between his eyes, a crimson design bloomed. The shifter's face blanched. "Shit," he muttered. "You're next," Range said. "Unless you give me some reason not to." Asa jerked the chair around so it was facing the now slumped sideways elemental. He yanked the blindfold off the leopard shifter. The shifter's eyes widened when he saw the elemental. It was his idea. Selling intuitives to the highest bidder. All his. Bullshit. Pain colored Range's tone. His features were drawn into a grimace of agony. "You're both guilty. We already know. Don't kill me. I'll stand trial before the Shifter Supreme Court for my crimes. Please let me stand trial." "You don't deserve a trial." Judge ground the words out between a clenched jaw and gritted teeth. "You were selling people intuitives. You could have killed my mate and my son." "Intuitives aren't people," the leopard shifter said, a smirk on his face. "Take him out," Judge pronounced. "Now. Take this son of a bitch out." Grizz put a hand on his shoulder. "Reconsider. They'll probably put him to death. Unless they decide to send him to Wiz Scary." Wiz Scary. An island isolated and remote, where all shifters who were sentenced to life, which was a long time for the shifters since longevity was a shifter trait. Hundreds of years spent in isolation on an island. Judge shuddered. He'd have chosen death. "We'll get him to the Shifter Supreme Court." Asa faced Range. "You'll hibernate while we take turns driving." "Not you," Range said to the other wolf shifter who'd been wounded, blood splattered across his clothing. "I fucking hate elementals," the blood-covered shifter spat. "Except May." Range nodded. "Starting to feel the same way myself." He turned to Judge and Grizz. "We got this. Why don't you all get out of here? It'd be better if you weren't around, in case." Judge didn't know what all the phrase "in case" might cover, and he sure as hell didn't want to find out. He had Lars and Lonnie to worry about. He had no business being involved in shifter hunting or enforcing, or anything else like that. He looked at Grizz and Lance. "Ready? Let's get your son home." Grizz clapped Judge on the back. "Don't have to tell me twice." Chapter 17. Judge, Lonnie, Lars, Pepper, Lance, Mac, Grizz, and Sierra piled into the Suburban and headed straight to Bear Canyon Valley. Except they had to make one little detour. Mac and Lonnie insisted they stop at a store and pick up a few necessities. "Seems little Lars has needs," Grizz said with a wink. Judge smirked. Had his uncle made the comment just so he could say his great-nephew's name, his own name? Then he sobered. wondering if Grizz never found anyone because of his brothers and himself. Was that why he had no kids of his own? Always watching after us. A pang of sadness traveled through Judge. He understood so much more now that he had his own son. Let's get on the road. This is no place for my son or my mate. He glanced at Lonnie's profile across the Suburban, a sleeping Lars between them. Would she agree to be his mate? She couldn't leave him. She couldn't take Lars away. Judge had no memories of a father. He'd been too young when his own was killed. I'll be damned if Lars will grow up without a father. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Taking it out, he couldn't help the smile that came to his face. He pressed to accept the call. Aunt May. Hi. Judge, Grizz caught me up, said that you were headed to Denver, but I haven't heard from him in a while now. Is everything okay? Have you found Lonnie? Yup. We're heading home. Well, all of us but Cross and Ariadne. They went with Range and his guys to the Denver satellite office of the compliance unit. Lonnie shot him a smile and put her fingers over her lips, pointing to the sleeping baby. Sorry, Judge mouthed to her and shifted the phone to the other ear. Oh, and Aunt May, the baby's name is Larson. May squealed. Judge pulled the phone away for a second until she'd settled down. Another shifter in the valley. May's tone was sentimental. He knew how much it meant to her to repopulate the valley with shifters. See you after a bit, Aunt May. And yeah, we're bringing the baby by to see Doc. And a friend. He glanced at Pepper, who sat in the back seat with Sierra and Grizz. She's injured. Could use some patching up. Oh my. We have some catching up to do. Yeah, we sure do. Judge had kept his gaze on Lonnie. He talked to his aunt. He had no idea what he'd say if May asked him any questions about Lonnie. Lonnie watched Judge in the window's reflection. She could see him watching her. She'd seen the tender looks he gave Lars. She got it. She felt the same way. The question was, how did Judge feel about her? I did abandon him, after all. Did he mean the words he'd said? Or were those words driven by the situation and adrenaline? She felt his gaze on her. We need to talk. Judge's voice was low. God. He's changed his mind. Her fears were not unfounded. She chewed on her bottom lip, fighting back the tears, and turned his way. His lips were almost curved into a smile. Did that bode well? Was what he wanted to talk about good? She fought to push her fears aside. Maybe he wasn't conditional, the way her family had been, the way the intuitive community had been. With them, if she wasn't what they wanted her to be, how they wanted her to be, she wasn't accepted. Their love was conditional. About what? She finally asked, curiosity and nerves getting the best of her. He glanced toward the back surreptitiously, then leaned closer until he was right above Lars. Lonnie leaned in. Pepper, he said. She frowned. God, please tell me I wasn't wrong about Judge. That he wouldn't criticize her and find fault with Pepper for what she did. She risked her life for me, Lonnie whispered. She's probably lost her I'm sure she has, Judge said. I caught a glimpse when Mac took a look at her before we left. He paused. That's why I thought we should talk. I don't know a lot about your community, but I have a feeling things won't be easy for her after this. They won't. She has no family. Her grandparents raised her, and they passed a couple years ago. That's what made it so easy for Reno to fool her. I'm guessing the intuitive community won't take her back. Not after word of this comes out. Which it will, sooner or later. Yeah. What I thought. So I had this idea. She leaned in. What? Build her a cabin next to ours. Ours? Did he just say ours? He did. Her heart did a happy dance. I shouldn't have doubted him. I'm not deaf, you two, Pepper said from the back. Busted. Lonnie's face grew hot as the blush rose. Sorry. She put her hand between the seats, reaching for Pepper's. "We're just worried about you." "You don't need to be. I have plans. While you were asleep, Sierra and I talked." "That's right." Sierra leaned forward. "Pepper's going to stay with me." Lonnie looked at Judge, then at Pepper. "You wouldn't be imposing." "True," Judge agreed. "We'd want you with us." "I'll visit." Pepper gave Lonnie's hand a pat. "But I think it would be good for me to spend time with Sierra. There are things she could teach me about being in exile." "Maybe we'll both visit," Sierra added. "But for now, you'll have your hands full with that little shifter of yours. Lars's instinct to shift is strong. He'll need lots of training." Judge glanced at Grizz. "Will you be taking part in his training?" "I don't think I'll be needed as much now that you, Lance, and Cross." He paused, turned away briefly. "There's a lady out there, hopefully waiting for me."
Epilogue. A week later.
Judge tangled his fingers in Lonnie's hair, pulling her head back, studying her expression. She was sending carnal signals, lighting a fire the bear and Judge couldn't help but respond to. These were the most treasured moments. Just as dawn came on, bathing their cabin bedroom in soft orange hues, making her flesh glow in the light. "I need you." Longing colored Lonnie's voice. He could tell from her scent she wanted him. He caressed her cheek, running the backs of his fingers along her smooth skin, filling his chest with her aroma. He wanted to spend his days learning her curves, worshiping the body he'd barely had a chance to explore, and reassuring her the past would stay there. He was over her walking out that morning. He feasted on the curve of her cheeks, the way her lips turned upward when she was thinking pleasant thoughts. Judge wrapped his hands around her waist, pressing against her. He inhaled the scent of vanilla in her hair. It merged with the scent of her desire, spurring him to an ache. Lonnie arched her back, pushing her full ass into the manifestation of his desire, coaching him with the promise of the sleekness she offered. Pressing hard against her ass, his insistent cock swelled. Judge took her by the hips and pulled her closer, grinding his hardness into her body. "Think Lars will give us a few moments of privacy this morning?" he whispered in her ear. The baby was sleeping in his cradle across the hallway. "And hopefully will be for a while longer." "I hope." She kissed his neck, her breath tickling. Judge pulled her t-shirt off, marveling at her full curves, ready to take her. Lonnie tugged on his briefs, undressing him in record time. "Ready?" Excitement glittered in her eyes, gleaming her exhilaration. He nodded. Judge ran his thumbs over her luscious hard nipples, taking each one between his thumb and fingers, rolling, pulling, and pinching them. Lonnie moaned, arching her breasts forward, her body begging for more. He took a nipple into his mouth and lavished it with attention from his tongue, flicking it, sucking it in deep, then scraping his teeth over it, while his hand tugged and pulled on her other nipple. Fuck. The scent of her sex was too much, no way could he resist. He slipped a finger between the wet folds of her nether lips, caressing her swollen clit, making deliberate firm circles. Lonnie's hips angled upward. Her nails dug into his shoulders as he picked up the tempo. He shoved 2 fingers in, sucked in by her moisture. Lonnie moaned, spreading her legs more. He thumbed her clit while his other hand pulled and pinched on her nipple. She let out a long moan, and her muscles tightened around his fingers, making him move faster and faster. Judge. Half moan, half whimper. That made him want to take her, to make her his forever, bonded and marked by his love with the bite of the couple bond. He wanted her to be sure, and he wasn't willing to rush her into anything she didn't tell him she wanted. Her pants grew louder. Christ. Her moans weren't helping his self-control. His cock throbbed to be inside her, his pulse beating a primitive cadence. His thrusting finger plunged into her. He added another digit, stretching her around his fingers, her moisture gliding down his hand. She threw her head back, her mouth wide in a primitive yell, grabbed his shoulder as she climaxed fiercely, crying out, arching into it, tightening around his fingers. I love you. Lonnie's words were such a low whisper. Even with his supernatural shifter hearing, He wondered if he'd heard her correctly. He kissed her lips tenderly, swallowing her gasps.
Lonnie trembled from her orgasm. She tried to control her breathing while her muscles were still clenching, Judge's fingers buried deeply within her. Did he hear me say I love him? He didn't say anything. Doubt, the same doubt that always crept in, threatening to destroy her. He leaned forward, kissing, his lips remaining on hers. She glanced away from the intensity in his gaze. Judge put his finger under her chin, tilting her face toward him, then he pulled back. Look at me. His tone was low as her words had been. She raised her gaze to his. His pupils swirled with his bear's gold flecks. I love you too. Always have. Always will. I want this. Us. Her voice was husky, enjoying the satiated expression on his face. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulled his head down, taking his lips captive, her tongue boldly claiming them. Judge's hands wound around her, his fingers pressing his erection against her body. I need you. The words burst from her mind and her mouth. Fuck. Judge's voice was low and hoarse. Lonnie lowered her hand, her fingers skimming over his wide chest, the abs that rippled as she traveled across his skin. She was almost there, almost at her objective, his springy curls touching her fingertips. She bit her lip. Boldly, she took his length in her hands, grasping him tightly, her fingers coursing up the hardness until she reached the thick mushroom head. Running her thumb over the drop gathered there, she spread it around the head of his cock, then under the rim of it, making slow, leisurely circles. She traced a fingernail gently along the underside. His sharp intake of breath made another pool flourish between her legs. She lowered herself and put the tip of her tongue on his slit, tasting him, then put her lips around the tip, sealing his head in her mouth, her lips wrapped around the ring of it. Judge released a loud hiss. You're killing me. Lonnie looked up at him. His face lit with desire, his jaws tightened with lust. Lonnie. He sucked air in, his chest filling, the muscles expanding. Now. Judge turned her around, then pushed her forward, bending her over, spreading her legs with his knees and a rocking of his hips. His hardness pressed against her entrance, and his hand pressed on her back, pushing her downward, making her ass rear up. He entered her swiftly and mercilessly. A whoosh of air escaped her lips at the fullness. God, I need you, he muttered, groaning with every stroke as he plunged in and out. Seizing her hips, he pounded into her, punishing and pleasing at the same time. I want to be yours. Forever. The words came from her unbidden, surprising, and yet so very truthful. There was nothing she wanted more than this man. This enforcer. The father of her son. The mate she'd always wanted. He stopped thrusting, leaned close to her ear. Be sure, Lonnie. Yes, she screeched, pushing back against him, taking him deeper. The sudden burst of pain from Judge's bite on her shoulder was swept away by the pleasure of his tongue licking at it, making her his. Forever. Behind her, Judge's body shuddered as he held her close. His heat filled her body, throbbing inside her. I love you. He kissed the spot where he'd bitten her. A few moments later, she nuzzled his neck, resting her head against that wide chest, the sweat of their joining drying, when a thought occurred to her. I like Cruz. Can we visit him? Sure, as soon as he tells us where he settles. Judge caressed her shoulders, his fingers skimming over the spot where he'd bonded her. He began to knead her muscles. You're spoiling me. Get used to it. I have a lot of time to make up for. Guilt washed over her, she had abandoned him. He caught the remorse in her eyes. Hey now. He leaned in, placed his lips on her forehead with a feather-light kiss. His breath was a warm cinnamon, woodsy scent. She felt his emotions, strong, vital, full of love, and closed her eyes to savor the impressions washing over her intuitive senses. Don't feel that way. It's all in the past. We have so much to look forward to. As if to punctuate that statement, from across the hallway, a baby's wail of hunger interrupted Judge. So demanding, Lonnie murmured. Nothing wrong with a man who knows what he wants. Judge leapt from the bed. I'll get him. Moments later, Judge walked in, a cooing Lars in his arms. Lonnie stared at her man, her mate, with his wide chest, broad shoulders, and strikingly handsome face and a wide grin as he looked down at their son. More than I ever thought I'd have. More than I deserve. Someone's hungry. Judge beamed, handing her the baby. I'll get breakfast. Hope you'll still be here when I get back. He shot her a wink. Always. Lonnie placed her lips against Lars's downy head, inhaling his baby scent. Always. I'm counting on that. Judge stepped into the hallway. You can count on it. Forever.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Shifters Forever Worlds book by Elle Thorne. Stay tuned for more episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell to be notified of new releases.